Well, hey everybody, we're into our second to last week as we journey through our Old Testament stories. And if you remember, over the last 3 weeks, we have looked at different people and we've asked the question, is this the rescuer that the Christians are looking for? Well, let's have a quick recap before we go any further, just to bring ourselves up to speed and to add on a little bit of extra so that you know what's happened in the story before we get to today's teaching point. Previously on our journey through the Bible. Well, at first, we saw that God created the world and said it was good. The only problem was, it wasn't set to last. You see, Adam and Eve disobeyed God and sin entered the world. So Christians are now looking for a rescuer. God decided to flood the world and start again. He used Noah to build an ark and save his family and animals. But Noah is not the rescuer we are looking for. Abraham was given a promise by God. He was told he was going to be the father of a great nation, and every family would be blessed through him. But again, Abraham was not the rescuer we are looking for. Between our two stories from last week and this week, Abraham had a son called Isaac, meaning laughter. Isaac then had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. They were twins. Jacob went on to have 12 sons. And he also had his name changed to Israel, which means wrestles with God. His family moved to Egypt and lived in peace for 430 years. And so now we move from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus. And sadly, the Pharaoh of the time doesn't like the Israelites, who are Jacob's family. He doesn't remember the good things that Joseph has done for them, and he decides to use them as slaves and then kill the baby boys that are born to them. This is a horrendous time for the Israelites, and they call out to God. But is God listening? Well, from then on, we zoom in to a family, a man and a woman who have 2 children already, Miriam, the daughter, and Aaron, a son. And they find out that they're expecting another baby. And I bet they wished and prayed to God and asked him to give them a daughter. Yet when the baby was born, he was a son. They tried to hide him from the Egyptians because, of course, they didn't want him to die. Yet he ended up growing up and becoming a bit too big and a bit too loud as a baby, and also probably a bit too stinky as well to be able to hide away. They decided that they'd make an ark for him, a small ark, a basket, and they'd waterproof it, and they'd put the baby inside and they'd float him down the Nile. Well, as he went into the Nile and floated down, the mum and dad told Miriam to follow after the baby and see what happens. The basket was spotted by a very important lady in Egypt. It was actually the princess. I'm sure Miriam was looking in thinking, oh no, this is the end of our baby. But the princess saw the baby and her heart went for him. She decided that she was going to keep him and grow him up to be one of her own children. At this point, Miriam kind of popped her head up out of some bulrushes and said, oh princess, why don't I send him to a nanny to care for him? And the princess had a think and said, that's a great idea. When he's old enough, he can come and live with me in the palace. But for now, send him to your nanny. And so Miriam took him back to his mum, and his mum cared for him until he was old enough to live in the palace. The princess called the baby Moses, which means taken from the river. Well, Moses grew up to be a man, and he did indeed live in the palace, but he couldn't stand the way the Israelite people were being treated as slaves. And one day he saw a slave driver beating one of the slaves, and he couldn't bear it any longer. He got off his horse and he killed the man. Moses was 40 years old, and he realized what he'd done, and he was terrified of what Pharaoh might do to him. So he fled, and he went out of Egypt and left, seemingly for good. But the people still called out to God. They still asked for God to help them. Was God listening? Another 40 years went by. Moses was 80 years old, and he was looking after his father-in-law's sheep. And as he was doing so, he noticed that a bush was on fire. So he went over to see about it, and he realized that this bush, although it was on fire, its leaves were still green. This was an amazing spectacle, and Moses, no doubt, was amazed at what he was seeing. And as he got closer, he heard a voice coming out of the bush. It was the voice of God. And he said to Moses, "Moses, I have heard my people's cry, and I have come down to rescue them." No doubt Moses was made up that the Israelite people were going to be rescued by God. And maybe he did a little dance, or he jumped up and down, or whatever else, until he heard the next part. You see, from all this dancing and all this kind of stuff, he then heard God say, "I'm sending you to Pharaoh to free my people." Well, Moses did everything he could to try and get out of it, yet God gave him miracles and even revealed his name. He called himself I Am, meaning I am the one God. It is me. Go on my confidence. And eventually Moses agreed to go with the help of his brother Aaron. Moses went to Egypt, and he said to Pharaoh, "Pharaoh, let my people go." And Pharaoh said, "No." And so God brought a plague on the land. A plague is like an awful disaster to happen to the people, but God was trying to use them to show Pharaoh that he was the one who was in control and that he should be listened to. Pharaoh, even after this plague, still said no. And so 9 times Moses went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." 9 times Pharaoh said no. And sometimes he said yes and then changed his mind again and said no. But 9 times ultimately he said no. And so 9 different plagues fell on the land. Things like frogs and gnats, like itchy bitey things. There was people covered in sores. The Nile turned to blood. It went dark. Even the cattle died. A locust swarmed. Oh, it was all sorts of horrendous things. And yet still Pharaoh was so stubborn that he said no, no, no. And then God said to Moses, "Tell all of the Israelite people to do something special. Have a meal. Have lamb for dinner. But take the blood of the lamb and paint it on your doorposts. And eat and sleep dressed ready to leave, because I'm about to free you." The people listened to what God had to say, and they painted blood on their doorposts. And then that night, God passed over the houses. And those without blood on the doorposts, the firstborn son died. Even in Pharaoh's palace, his firstborn son died. But for those with blood on the doorposts, God passed over. Now, this is really amazing, because even today, the Jewish people still celebrate the festival called Passover. And that's exactly what they remember: God passing over their ancestors' houses and saving them from this judgment. Well, the next day Moses went back to Pharaoh, and no doubt Pharaoh was absolutely devastated at what happened. And so he said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And this time Pharaoh said, "Go." The people left Egypt. But you remember Abraham's promise that he was given, that he'd have more children than the stars in the sky. He was going to be the father of a great nation. Well, as they left Egypt, more than 1 million Israelite people, more than 1 million people in their family left. They left slavery and they headed into freedom. Well, that's a great story, isn't it? And it's found in the book of Exodus. But don't forget our big question. Who is the rescuer? So let's ask the question, is Moses our rescuer? Well, Moses came from the Israelite people. So he's part of Abraham's line. So he could bless all the families on the earth. Moses was a good man. He listened to and obeyed God. And he did many, many good things when they were in the wilderness, wandering to the promised land after they were free. It seems like Moses is a great man, but he's not the rescuer. You see, Moses never made it to the promised land. He died just before the Israelite people entered into their place that God had promised them. So Moses isn't the rescuer. We're looking for a rescuer that will never die. We're looking for a rescuer that will lead the people into the promised land and stay with them. So let's keep looking for our rescuer.